Australia is making waves with a colossal investment of 125 billion Australian dollars in mega railways, kicking off an ambitious journey to transform its transportation landscape. From tackling city traffic to introducing cutting-edge metro projects, this significant financial commitment signals a strategic move to redefine how Australians travel and connect in the decades to come. So guys, join us as we look into the details of this massive initiative and explore how this project is shaping the future of transportation in Australia. With that said, let's dive in. First of all, I must state that we have indeed been making subway lines the wrong way, because if you check out subway systems globally, you'll notice a common pattern. Well, most of them were built in the middle of the last century, and they were made to do one thing: get you from your home in the suburbs to your job in the city centre as fast as possible. But times have changed, and cities don't work the same way anymore. All around the world, countries are making big changes to fix and adjust these old city loop designs. However, it's an expensive endeavour. Melbourne, a city in Australia, is putting in a whopping AUD 125 billion for a huge infrastructure project. This project is a major upgrade to the metro system, and get this, it's going to take more than half a century to finish. So why aren't these metro lines working for most cities anymore? The simple answer is that people live and work everywhere now. Parts of cities aren't strictly residential or commercial anymore, they're a mix of both. Take Melbourne for example. Initially, all the offices and shops were in the central grid, but back then nobody actually lived there. Everyone lived in the suburbs. After World War II, they extended the train lines into these growing suburbs to bring people in and out of the city. It worked fine for a while, but nowadays people live in apartments right in the city, and offices are scattered everywhere. So the old and straightforward system just doesn't cut it anymore. Let's say you lived in Burwood but worked in Caulfield and wanted to take public transport. You'd have to go all the way into the central business district and then back out again. This journey by train would take you an hour and 20 minutes, while driving would only take 16 minutes. Quite a hassle, right? So in cities like London, Singapore, Moscow and Tokyo, their metro lines are considered some of the best globally. But if you take a look at their maps, you'll notice something interesting. There are tons of lines crossing over each other, forming rings around not just the city centre, but also the outer areas. This setup gives people choices and lets them take different routes, not just the typical commute from the suburbs to work, like in the Mad Men era. Now, Melbourne is tackling this same issue with a huge project that only comes around once in a century. Surprisingly, not many people in Melbourne use the trains as much as they can. Even though it's now Australia's most populous city with about 5 million people, that's 19% of all Australians. The train usage isn't as high as it should be. Despite having more skyscrapers than London and Beijing combined, hosting the Olympics, Luna Park, and even being the hometown of Margot Robbie, well, before she became Barbie, Melbourne's public transport, especially the metro, isn't as top-notch as you'd expect. Here's a stat for you. In the 2021 census, it was found that around 50% of people in Melbourne drive to work in a car, while only 3% take the train. To fix this, the city's working on building more rail lines outside the city centre, and they're calling it the Suburban Rail Loop. They're trying to make it easier for people to get around, especially those living in the suburbs. The Suburban Rail Loop is a massive project that's about 90 kilometres long and will go around the outer suburbs of Melbourne. But don't hold your breath, it's not going to be done anytime soon. This huge project costs a whopping AUD 125 billion, and they're breaking it down into 4 parts. The first part, covering 26 kilometres with twin tunnels and 6 new stations, is estimated to cost around $33 billion and should be done by 2035. The second phase, connecting to the city's airport, is expected to be finished between 2043 and 2053. Now brace yourself, the entire loop won't be done until 2084. Yeah, it's a super long-term project. Some experts think the Suburban Rail Loop is just a way to shake up the political scene in Melbourne, but there are even bigger money questions. The project is missing about a third of the proposed funding from something called value capture. Meanwhile, more and more people in Australia are feeling the pinch of inflation. Rent and fuel costs keep going up. Even in the States, where the stock market was doing well at the beginning of the year, the idea of interest rates hanging around for a while is making the S&P 500 head for its biggest drop since December. The markets are getting jittery, and by mid-September, global investors had sold nearly $17 billion in equity funds, with US stocks leading the way. Analysts are starting to say we might be in for a rough landing in the next year, and smart investors are already getting ready for it. So, how is Australia planning to build this suburban rail loop? Now, before Melbourne's massive suburban rail loop can be built, they need to deal with the traffic mess in the middle of the city. To fix that, they're working on building something called the Metro Tunnel. This tunnel is going to be about 40 metres below the streets of Melbourne, and these big machines have been digging 2 tunnels that are 9 kilometres long each. These tunnels will create a new train line from the west to the southeast, connecting 5 new stations along the way. But why is this tunnel such a big deal? Well, it's the first step in giving Melbourne's infrastructure a makeover because it deals with a big problem that many city loop designs have: a bottleneck. See, when every train line has to go through the centre of the city, it limits how many trains can run. Unlike in London or New York, where you can expect a train to show up every few minutes, in Melbourne you might have to wait 10 or 20 minutes. That means you have to plan your trip in advance, and if you miss the train, well, you're in for a late arrival. Now, building this tunnel wasn't always a straightforward decision. Some politicians wanted to focus on trains, while others preferred highways. When they finally decided to build it, there was a hiccup. People found out that the massive tunnel would mess up the main street and split Melbourne in half for years. One politician even compared it to the Berlin Wall, so they had to get creative with the plans. Instead of tearing up the entire Swanston Street, they took down specific buildings along the tunnel's path and dug underneath the street. Now, speaking of the tunnel boring machines, or TBMs, there are 4 of these giants responsible for digging the twin tunnels for the Metro Tunnel. They're massive, each weighing more than 1,100 tons and reaching 120 meters in length, about the size of the skyscrapers they're burrowing beneath. Each TBM has a cutter head on top that weighs 100 tons, acting like a drill that can cut through rock 6 times harder than concrete. You could think of the TBMs almost like submarines, with a crew of up to 10 people, including an operator, work on each TBM around the clock, equipped with everything from offices and kitchens to toilets. They had a high-tech navigation system to keep them on course and make sure they didn't accidentally drill into something they shouldn't. These TBMs got some cool names inspired by local female heroes, ranging from the state's first woman premier to an Australian cricket captain. They even gave each TBM its own unique colour. The first TBM, named Joan, started its digging mission from Arden in 2020, and a few weeks later, Meg joined the action. The other 2 TBMs joined in a few months after that, starting from the opposite end of the tunnel. All 4 of these giants met in the middle around mid-2021. The first part of Melbourne's rail journey, thanks to these TBMs, is expected to open in just over a year. Even though the entire project will take many decades to finish, it's officially on its way. The wheels are turning, or in this case, the TBMs are digging. Melbourne has a clear vision for the kind of city it's going to be by the end of the century, and it's not going to be a small one. It's aiming big. Alright guys, that wraps up our video for today. If you found this video interesting and useful, please do well to give us a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button for more.